Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you for being here today, and a special thanks to the organizers at Msheireb for putting together Qatar Sustainability Week. It's a very impressive event, and I'm sure this event will continue to gain traction and value for the years to come. My name is Sarah Al Dorani, and I am the founder of Beehive Recycling. Before I touch upon what it is that we do at Beehive, I'd like to take a moment to discuss incentivizing change from a macro level to a micro level. How do nations, corporations, and individuals make decisions that are behavioral change towards greener choices? We'll look at various behavioral changes and applications. How do positive incentives versus negative incentives work? And what's actually effective? Let's start by looking at multi-nations. Can nations come together with their differing agendas and agree on tangible outcomes to address the climate change issue and the pollution problem? Each year, we see decision makers gather around the world to discuss climate change policies. While this initiative is indeed honorable and very much needed, there are two main issues to consider. Firstly, how can countries with different agendas and different priorities find common ground? The carbon credit system, which came into debate in 1997, is still very much a debatable topic. And why? Because the carbon credit system benefits some nations and penalizes others. Finding common ground continues to be a challenge, and we simply can't wait for these nations to come towards a global alliance. So I'd like to shift our focus from the global agenda to individual countries and their national efforts. Government incentives. Let's look at what some countries are doing on the inside of their borders to fight climate change. And we'll start by comparing Sweden and Singapore. Sweden has created what we call a recycling revolution. Only 1% of household waste is actually going to landfills. What happens to the rest, you might ask? Well, more than 50% of the waste is turned into energy to warm homes of over 1 million people. And the rest, well, it's recycled. Sweden's recycling efforts have been so successful that the country now has to import at least 2 million tons of waste and rubbish from other European countries. So what actually worked for Sweden? Well, two factors. One, positive incentives, and two, law enforcement. This was the winning recipe. Sweden implemented can and bottle deposit systems since 1984, starting with aluminum, and then in 1994, adding plastic. Sweden also has a sophisticated waste collection system, and they recycle almost all of the waste from households within 300 meters of every single household. They have pipelines running underground that suck the trash from these households. Another incentive is cheaper energy. As I mentioned before, more than half of the waste is converted into heat and provides affordable energy for these households. In comparison, let's take a look at Singapore. As many of you may be aware, Singapore is considered one of the cleanest countries on the planet. But did you actually know that Singapore's recycling rate is actually low, very low? 40% of the residents' recycled waste that's put into bins isn't even recyclable. It's either contaminated or it's not the actual recyclable material that is able to be used. Moreover, Singapore's recycling is not processed domestically. Instead, it's exported abroad to many other Asian countries. Waste management is now becoming a critical issue in Singapore because of one factor. They have a single landfill, And this landfill is meant to be overflowing by 2035. And once that happens, all of their waste will have to be exported. So what went wrong for Singapore? Well, two things again. There is no law enforcement for recycling. There are law enforcements, however, for littering, which many of you might be aware. There is a littering fine of $2,000 if you litter once, and up to $10,000 if you litter 3 times. More so, there's no incentives, no positive incentive scheme, which I'll touch upon in a little bit. There's no education for Singaporeans to understand what to recycle and how to recycle. So the connection with the recycling journey isn't really there. One major company in Singapore, back in 2019, decided to test whether incentivizing positively would work, and it did. They placed, similar to Sweden, vending machines where if you put your aluminum or plastic bottles, you get cash back. And it was so successful that the lines went for miles long. And the company decided to control these lines, they should lower the value of the coupon that they were giving to these individuals. Once they lowered the value of the coupon, the lines disappeared, and so did the intention to recycle. This brings me to my next group of stakeholders, corporations. To what extent are they responsible for the waste generated? When it comes to corporations, what motivates them to uphold environmental and sustainable values? Well, environmental taxes, also known as the eco-tax, it's actually hard to track for companies because they can't identify exactly the amount of impact and measure that impact when it comes to their waste, and neither can governments. But what does seem to be motivating companies these days in a big and impactful way is called ESG. That stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Criteria. There's actually a scoring mechanism for corporations when it comes to their ESG. Increasingly, around the globe, investors and investment funds are seeking ESG scores from companies. Publicly traded companies now are asked to reveal their ESG scores when it comes to global stock markets. Even in Qatar, we've started to ask for these numbers. For this reason, corporate sustainability is quickly becoming a priority for these corporations. Unilever, which is the home where all of these brands sit under, is quickly making sustainability a priority. And how are they doing this? Well, they've committed that by 2030, they will have 0 greenhouse gas emissions, not just from their production, but also from their products themselves, making them reusable from the product to the packaging. I clicked the wrong button. Can someone help me? Sorry. All right, there we go. So Microsoft is another example. They've committed to 3 excellent objectives. The first is becoming carbon negative by 2030. The second, which is quite unique, they're going to be removing historical carbon emissions by 2050. So for the history of Microsoft being as a corporation. And finally, they're creating a $1 billion fund for climate innovation. This now brings me down to individuals and people. What motivates individuals to make a change? And how can we achieve positive incentives for these individuals and maybe influence in reverse from the micro level to the macro level? Well, we can achieve this by giving consumers the power, the purchasing power, the demand power, and supplying them with eco-friendly products and options that wouldn't harm their financial means and that would be within it. We call this green nudges, which means you're not forcing individuals to make these green choices, but instead you're encouraging it. It's all about humanizing the incentive and making them very personal. Consumer demand is helping to shift the offering from companies. Studies show that products that have labeled themselves as more sustainable are 6 times more in demand than products that don't label themselves as sustainable. So, coming back home to Qatar and its community, we can learn a lot from these nations, from these corporations, when it comes to waste management. Events such as Qatar Sustainability Week is an important part of this movement because we're bringing together like minds from universities, from companies, artists, students, entrepreneurs to share in their discussion, in their learning, and to motivate this change. At Beehive, we believe in the power of individuals coming together to create massive change and shift consumer choices, because when multiplied, we can make an impactful change. This is where the name Beehive actually came from, a hive of like-minded individuals working together to sustain an environment. At Beehive, we understood a few things. We first understood the importance of making recycling easy and accessible and convenient for individuals. That's why we developed an app where you can subscribe to recycling services and with a touch of a button, have the collection come to your door and collect your waste. But we understood a little bit more than just that. We understood the power of positive incentives. And with this, we decided to give for every collection an amount of green points, or green credits of our own, if you will. And with these green points, you can redeem them with our eco-partners who are selling green products and who are helping to make a tangible difference. We understood the importance of these positive incentives, but what we also understood, more important than anything I've said, is that we cannot wait for nations to agree on how to make a change. We can't wait for governments either to make this change because it comes down to policy, and policy can take time. So, we can certainly influence corporations, and how do we do so? By coming together as a community, as individual like minds, and choosing to be a little bit more green. I hope that you will make greener choices with your friends, with your colleagues, with your wider community to protect our planet that we call home. Thank you.